At 1:40 in the morning, a heart began to race, not because of a nightmare, not because of a medication change, not because of anything a doctor could explain away with a chart or a clinical note. It raced because something was wrong. Because somewhere inside a quiet home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, an 84-year-old woman's body knew, before any door opened, before any camera captured anything, before the world had any idea what was about to happen. Her body already knew, and the device inside her chest recorded every second of it. That device is a pacemaker. It is roughly the size of a matchbox. It has been running continuously since the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. It has years of battery life remaining. It is logging data, time-stamping every cardiac event, preserving every physiological second of whatever has happened to her since February 1st, 2026. And right now, as you watch this, the FBI cannot read a single moment of what it has captured since she vanished. Not because the technology doesn't exist, not because the data isn't there, but because the only way to access what that device has recorded is to find Nancy Guthrie herself. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal forensic reality of the most extraordinary missing persons investigation in modern American history. What you are about to hear is not a recap of the headlines you already know. This is the forensic layer underneath them. The one being worked in laboratories, in manufacturer server rooms, aboard helicopters over the Sonoran Desert, and inside the offices of genetic scientists who are racing to finish technology that has never existed before, specifically because of this case. If you are new here, welcome to True Crime Files. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what we are about to walk through is the most forensically detailed account of this investigation that has ever been assembled in one place. And when this case breaks, and the evidence says it will, you need to have been here from the beginning. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, and she was someone's mother. That fact sounds simple. It is not, because her daughter is Savannah Guthrie, co-host of NBC's Today Show, one of the most recognized faces in American broadcast journalism. And the visibility that came with that connection, the resources it mobilized, the tip lines it flooded, the forensic science it accelerated, would ultimately shape this investigation in ways that no other missing persons case in recent memory has ever experienced. But on the evening of January 31st, 2026, none of that mattered yet. On January 31st, Nancy Guthrie had dinner with her daughter and son-in-law. She drove home through the Catalina foothills neighborhood, the kind of quiet, elevated Tucson suburb where the houses sit back from the road and the desert presses in at the edges of everything. Her garage door closed at approximately 10:10 in the evening. Her pacemaker logged the entire evening without a single flag. Through dinner, through the drive home, through the garage door closing, her cardiac baseline was completely stable, resting heart rate, normal rhythm, a woman winding down after an ordinary night, a heart functioning exactly within expected parameters. The device inside her chest was doing what it was designed to do: monitor a cardiac system that had no reason on that evening to demand any attention at all. For investigators who would later spend weeks inside that data, this portion of the record would matter enormously, not because of what it contained, but because of what it established. A baseline, a before, a portrait of normal that made everything that came after impossible to misread. Nancy Guthrie had a cardiac implantable electronic device that communicated through two separate channels. The first was a Bluetooth connection to her personal Apple devices, her phone, her tablet, a primary sync that updated regularly and kept her medical team informed of her cardiac status in near real time. The second was a background transmission protocol, an independent channel that communicated directly with her cardiologist's office and with the device manufacturer's cloud server, operating quietly alongside the primary system, logging and transmitting without requiring any action from Nancy herself. At home, a base unit, plugged into the wall of her bedroom like any ordinary appliance, received that data continuously and forwarded it to the manufacturer's cloud platform. Every cardiac event the pacemaker logged was transmitted to that cloud in near real time. Every timestamp, every arrhythmia detection, every variation above or below her programmed threshold parameters, all of it preserved in a server, waiting. Nancy Guthrie did not know, on the night of January 31st, that those servers would become the most important forensic archive in the investigation into her own disappearance. She did not know that a team of forensic cardiologists would spend weeks inside that data, reading the rhythm of her heart the way a detective reads a crime scene, looking not for medical information but for a sequence of events, a timeline, a story told entirely in the language of a human body under pressure. She went to sleep. The data quieted. And then, somewhere between 10:50 and 11:30 in the evening, something changed. It was not dramatic. That is the important thing to understand about the first anomaly in Nancy Guthrie's cardiac record that night. A cardiologist reviewing it in isolation, pulled from its context, evaluated purely as a clinical data point, would note it and move on. Heart rates fluctuate. An unexpected sound from outside. A sudden shift in position. A moment of mild alertness in someone who has not yet fully settled into sleep. Any of those things can produce a brief elevation above a resting baseline. The pacemaker logged it exactly as it was designed to. A short, time-stamped cardiac elevation that lasted a few minutes and then resolved. Nothing about it, standing alone, demanded attention. But investigators were not reviewing it in isolation. They were reviewing it against everything that came after, and reviewed in that context, placed at the beginning of what would become a forensic sequence that nobody in this investigation was prepared for. That brief, unremarkable elevation becomes something else entirely. It becomes the first data point, the opening entry in a record that would ultimately tell investigators more about what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home that night than any camera, any witness, or any physical piece of evidence recovered from the scene. Something caused that elevation. Something shifted Nancy Guthrie's cardiac baseline between 10:50 and 11:30 on the evening of January 31st, hours before any visible event, hours before any masked figure approached any camera. What that something was, whether it was entirely ordinary or whether it was the first physiological tremor of an intrusion already beginning, is one of the questions that investigators have been working inside ever since. What followed it was quiet. Between approximately 11:30 at night and 1:30 in the morning, the data stabilized completely. Lower heart rate, regular rhythm, the pacemaker logging without incident through what appeared, by every cardiac measure, to be a period of sleep. 2.5 hours of relative calm in the record. 2.5 hours that investigators would later frame as the pause before the most significant cardiac event in the entire data set. They called it, in the forensic reconstruction they were building, the calm before. It was an accurate description, because what came after that calm was something no one who later read that data was prepared for. Not in its intensity, not in its timing, and not in what it implied about the moment Nancy Guthrie's world changed forever. At approximately 1:40 in the morning on February 1, 2026, the pacemaker data changed again, and this time, it did not resolve. What the device recorded at 1:40 in the morning was not a brief elevation. It was not a mild fluctuation above a resting baseline. It was a sharp, sudden, dramatic spike. The kind of cardiac response the human body generates under one specific category of circumstance. The kind that does not come from a restless dream or an unexpected sound. The kind that the autonomic nervous system produces when a person becomes acutely aware of a threat. When the body shifts, without conscious instruction, into a state of alarm. That spike was recorded at 1:40 in the morning, 7 minutes before the doorbell camera went dark. Sit with that for a moment. 7 minutes before any camera captured anything. 7 minutes before the masked figure at the front door appeared in any footage. 7 minutes before the visible record of that night's events even began. Nancy Guthrie's heart had already responded. Her body had already registered something. The pacemaker had already begun logging what forensic cardiologists would later describe as the physiological signature of confrontation. The device inside her chest did not wait for the camera. It did not wait for a door to open or a figure to appear. It recorded the moment her body knew, and it preserved that moment with a timestamp that places the beginning of this crime not at 1:47 when the camera sees something, but 7 minutes earlier, when the body already felt it. This is what makes the pacemaker data extraordinary as forensic evidence. Not simply that it recorded events. All monitoring devices do that. What makes it extraordinary is that it recorded events that no external system captured. It documented the interior of the crime before its exterior was visible. And that data, sitting in a manufacturer's cloud server since the moment it was transmitted, was waiting for the FBI from the very first day of the investigation. They came for it within the first week. The FBI subpoenaed the cardiac device manufacturer in the first days of February 2026. What came back from that subpoena was not a medical chart. It was a timeline, a forensic record of 41 minutes that no camera, no neighbor, no witness, and no physical piece of evidence recovered from the scene could have provided. 41 minutes of external darkness, the window between 1:47 in the morning when the doorbell camera was last active and 2008 in the morning when the pacemaker's primary Bluetooth connection to Nancy's Apple devices went dark. To read that data properly required a specific kind of expertise that sits at the intersection of two very different fields. Forensic cardiologists, specialists who understand how to interpret cardiac telemetry not as a medical chart but as a sequence of events, went to work on the recovered cloud data. Their task was not to assess Nancy Guthrie's cardiac health. It was to reconstruct, from the rhythm of her heart over those 41 minutes, a narrative of what was happening to her. The process required proprietary software. It required specialists who understood how programmed threshold parameters translate into physiological stress responses. And critically, it required a chain of custody that preserved every single data point as admissible evidence, because every timestamp in that cloud record would eventually need to stand up in a courtroom. What the forensic reconstruction revealed about those 41 minutes has become the backbone of the FBI's understanding of how the crime unfolded. The spike at 1:40 that preceded the camera footage, the sustained pattern through the window of external darkness, the moment at 2:28 when the primary sync connection ended, and then the secondary channel kept going. This is the detail that most coverage of this case has failed to explain clearly enough. When the Bluetooth connection to Nancy's Apple devices went dark at 2:28 in the morning, the pacemaker did not go silent. The background transmission protocol, the independent secondary channel communicating directly with the cardiologist's office, remained active. It kept transmitting. In the days immediately following Nancy's disappearance, while the world was processing the news that she was gone, her cardiac device was still broadcasting data to her medical team. And that data did not return the signal pattern that indicates the absence of life. This is why Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stood in front of cameras in the first days of February 2026 and told the world that he believed Nancy Guthrie was alive. He was not offering hope for its own sake. He was not speculating. He was reading clinical, time-stamped, transmitted data from inside a cardiac device that was still functioning inside a living person. A sheriff at a podium, reading a heartbeat. That has never happened before in an American missing persons investigation, and it changed, from the very first week, the entire operational posture of every team working this case. They were not searching for remains. They were searching for a person who, the data said, was still alive. Picture a helicopter moving slowly over the Sonoran Desert, not at cruising altitude, deliberately low, the kind of altitude where you can see individual rooftops, individual yards, individual cars parked in driveways, and mounted on one of the helicopter's skids, secured and operational, is a device that most people have never heard of. It is scanning continuously. Hundreds of Bluetooth signals passing through its antenna every second, phones, smartwatches, wireless speakers, car systems, and it is eliminating every single one of them, one by one, automatically, because it is not looking for any of those. It is looking for one specific signal, one unique electronic fingerprint, a media access control address, a MAC address, that belongs to a single cardiac device implanted in the chest of an 84-year-old woman who had been missing for weeks. Every Bluetooth-enabled device in the world has a MAC address. It is hard-coded into the hardware at the point of manufacture. It is unique. No two devices in existence share it. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker has one. The FBI knew it, and they built an aerial scanning system specifically designed to find it. The signal sniffer uses a directional antenna paired with amplification technology and continuous scanning software. When it detects a Bluetooth signal, it reads the MAC address and compares it against the target. If it does not match, the software eliminates it instantly and moves on. It does not stop. It does not rest. It scans and eliminates and scans again. Every second the helicopter remains in the air, over suburban neighborhoods, over rural highway corridors, over miles of Arizona desert terrain. Cybersecurity expert Morgan Wright, founder of the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases, described the operation plainly. "The process," he said, "is similar to walking through a crowd holding Nancy's phone, waiting for her pacemaker to request a connection, except scaled to an aerial search grid covering hundreds of square miles of terrain. The concept is sound. The MAC address targeting is precise. But there is a problem with this operation that nobody discussed loudly enough. And it matters if you want to understand how this investigation actually works beneath the surface. Pacemakers do not broadcast like cell towers. They do not emit a continuous wide-range signal designed to be detected from a distance. They communicate in short-range bursts, near-field communication, designed to reach a paired device within a few feet. Digital forensics examiner Carl Epps, a specialist with more than 25 years of experience, was direct about what that means operationally. Getting a signal detection from that device, he said, is highly unlikely unless investigators are almost directly on top of it. Almost directly on top of it. Think about what that means in practice. The FBI was flying a helicopter over hundreds of square miles of Arizona terrain, hunting a signal that only broadcasts within arm's reach. That is not a comprehensive search. That is a precise technology deployed against impossible odds. A directional antenna pointed at a desert, hoping to pass within feet of a woman who could be anywhere, and yet they kept flying. Because stopping, accepting that the technology had reached its operational limit and walking away, was not something this investigation was willing to do. The alternative to an unlikely detection was not an impossible one. It was simply a harder one. And while the helicopter remained in the air, a separate team was already reading something from a server room that the aerial search could never provide. The cloud data from before 2:28 in the morning was already in the laboratory, and what it contained about those 41 minutes was rewriting the forensic map of this case from the ground up. Go back to the doorbell camera footage. The masked figure approaches the front door at approximately 1:47 in the morning. Gloved hands, dark clothing, a backpack, and in one specific moment, the clip where the suspect turns directly toward the camera before covering the lens, there is an object held between his teeth, a flashlight, gripped in his mouth, hands free, while he worked. That detail was noted in early coverage of the case, and then moved past. It should not have been, because C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, a scientist who has used DNA evidence to help solve more than 300 cold cases, reviewed the publicly available footage and the details of the evidence collected at Nancy Guthrie's home, and she came back to that flashlight. Specifically, she came back to what holding an object in your mouth leaves behind. When a person holds any object between their teeth for any period of time, the mucous membranes of the mouth deposit organic residue directly onto the surface of that object. Cellular material, biological contribution from the suspect's own body. This is not a contact transfer. It is not a secondary deposit from incidental touching. It is a direct, high-quality biological contribution, the cleanest possible source of genetic material outside of a controlled laboratory sample. Moore was precise. Even weeks after the event, she said, that kind of biological material is recoverable under the right laboratory conditions. DNA is resilient. It does not simply vanish. Given proper storage, proper handling, and proper analysis, a sample deposited that way could still yield a usable genetic profile. And here is why that matters so much in the context of this specific investigation. Every other DNA lead in this case had hit a wall. 2 black gloves recovered from a road approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home, the location initially assessed as a deliberate disposal site along the suspect's exit route, were tested, and the DNA profile came back. It matched, but not to a suspect. It matched to a worker from a nearby restaurant who had no connection to the investigation whatsoever. The gloves had been discarded by someone entirely unrelated to the case, at a location 2 miles from the scene, on what investigators had assessed as a disposal route. That is not just a dead end. That is a coincidence so precisely placed that it briefly redirected the entire investigation before the results came back and collapsed the lead entirely. A Range Rover was seized by Pima County Sheriff's Office and the FBI from a restaurant parking lot near Nancy's home. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffendorfer publicly confirmed that investigators processed that vehicle, searching its interior for DNA evidence and attempting to cross-reference any biological material recovered against samples already collected from the Guthrie residence. The results of that analysis were not publicly disclosed. The vehicle was not publicly connected to a named suspect, but it was seized, it was processed. And what investigators found, or failed to find, inside, it shaped the direction of the investigation in ways that were never fully reported. Against that backdrop, against a trail of DNA leads that either cleared the wrong person or stalled in a laboratory, the flashlight represents something none of the other evidence has offered. A potential direct, uncontaminated, single-source genetic sample from the person who stood at Nancy Guthrie's door. Law enforcement has not publicly confirmed whether that flashlight was recovered or tested. That silence is its own kind of answer. The FBI has DNA from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Let that sit for a moment. They have it. It is in a laboratory right now. Investigators believe it may belong to the person who took her. And more than 2 months after Nancy disappeared from her home in the Catalina foothills, they still cannot use it. Not because of a legal barrier, not because of a chain of custody problem, not because anyone failed to collect it properly. They cannot use it because the technology required to read it does not yet fully exist. If you are finding this level of forensic detail valuable, this is exactly the kind of coverage True Crime Files brings to every case that demands it. Take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It keeps this investigation visible and makes sure you are here when the next major development breaks. This is the part of the Nancy Guthrie investigation that the headlines have consistently failed to explain. It begins with 2 words that sound technical but carry enormous weight in this case: mixed sample. When forensic scientists describe DNA evidence as mixed, they mean the sample contains genetic material from more than one person, on surfaces that multiple people have touched. A doorknob, a countertop, a piece of furniture. This is common, expected. The science of separating those profiles, of pulling one person's genetic signature out of a sample that contains several, is called deconvolution. For standard 2-person mixtures, laboratories have reliable tools to do exactly that. The problem in this case is that the mixture recovered from inside Nancy's home is not standard. The number of contributors, the proportions of each profile within the sample, and the quality of the material itself have pushed the evidence beyond what current whole genome sequencing technology can cleanly resolve. The laboratory reported challenges immediately. The timeline for getting this evidence to a point where it can even be submitted for investigative genetic genealogy, the process that identified the Golden State Killer, the process that put Brian Kohberger in a courtroom, could stretch to months, possibly longer. And then something happened in this investigation that has no precedent in the history of forensic science. A company had already been developing new mixture deconvolution software specifically designed to handle the kind of complex multi-contributor samples that existing technology cannot resolve. That software had a planned future release date. That release date has been moved up, accelerated, prioritized. Because of Nancy Guthrie's case specifically, scientists who had been working toward a future deployment are now working against a clock that has a missing 84-year-old woman on the other side of it. They are not running toward a product launch. They are running toward a person. An active criminal investigation is not just being conducted with the forensic tools that currently exist. It is pulling new ones out of development and into deployment in real time, driven by the urgency of one specific case, one specific woman, one specific pacemaker still recording in the dark. That has never happened before at this scale. And the scientists racing to finish that software know exactly whose name is on the other side of the deadline they are working against. Every dead end in a criminal investigation tells you something. That is not a motivational statement. It is forensic methodology. When a lead dissolves, when a piece of evidence that looked like a breakthrough traces back to the wrong person, the wrong vehicle, the wrong location, what remains is a negative data point. And negative data points, built carefully and systematically, become a map of what the suspect is not, which, assembled with enough precision, becomes a map of what the suspect is. In the weeks following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, investigators accumulated several of those negative data points in rapid succession, and the pattern they form when placed side by side is more revealing than any single one of them appeared to be in isolation. The gloves cleared an unrelated restaurant worker, the Range Rover was processed, and produced no publicly confirmed connection to a named individual. The suspect's clothing, the Ozark Trail, 25-liter hiker backpack sold exclusively through Walmart at the time of the footage, the mask assessed as consistent with styles also available at Walmart, appearing lighter in infrared than its actual color. Every item selected to dissolve into the commercial noise of mass retail. Deliberately generic, deliberately untraceable. Every purchase designed to be one of thousands of identical transactions, invisible in the retail data that investigators would inevitably search. That is not the behavior of someone who acted impulsively. That is operational planning. And it connects directly to something a neighbor reported, that most people have not properly linked to the clothing evidence, to the disposal route, or to the overall behavioral profile taking shape in this investigation. 3 weeks before the night of February 1st, on January 11, 2026, a man was seen moving slowly along the street near Nancy Guthrie's home. Dark clothing, baseball cap, moving in a manner the neighbor described as studied, as though he was examining the properties along the route, not walking with purpose toward a destination, walking with the specific, unhurried attention of someone conducting a survey, someone who was not in a hurry because he was not going anywhere. He was learning something. 3 weeks of pre-operational reconnaissance, deliberately untraceable clothing, gloves disposed of 2 miles from the scene along a pre-planned exit route, a vehicle of interest processed in a parking lot that has never been publicly connected to a name, a home entered in the space of 41 minutes with enough operational precision to leave investigators, months later, still working to identify a single confirmed suspect. The picture that emerges from these dead ends is not comforting. It is the profile of someone who prepared, someone who studied, someone who chose Nancy Guthrie specifically, approached her home deliberately, and left behind a forensic trail that has been engineered, at every turn, to dissolve. And yet, the FBI kept pulling, because the thread that holds is always there. And in this case, it was being built not from physical evidence, but from a database, and from a gap in that database that ordinary people watching this right now have the power to close. In almost every high-profile missing persons investigation, there comes a moment when the lens turns inward, when the people closest to the victim, the ones making public appeals, fielding calls from law enforcement, sitting in front of cameras, become part of the investigative frame themselves, not always because evidence points toward them, sometimes simply because proximity demands it. Because in the forensic methodology of any serious investigation, the people nearest to a missing person are always the first variables that need to be eliminated before the search can move outward with confidence. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that moment arrived quietly and then very publicly in the first week of February 2026. Federal agents and local law enforcement arrived at the Tucson home of Annie Guthrie, Nancy's eldest daughter, with a search warrant. The operation lasted approximately 2 hours. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's other daughter and NBC Today co-host, was reportedly inside the home when agents arrived. She had been staying with Annie and Annie's husband, Tommaso Cioni, in the days following her mother's disappearance. Law enforcement personnel were observed leaving the property carrying evidence bags. What those bags contained was not publicly disclosed. What was reported through investigative journalist sourcing was that 2 surveillance cameras were found inside Annie's home in a condition that required noting. That detail entered the public record. It generated significant online speculation, and it sat there, uncontextualized, for days. Then Sheriff Chris Nano stepped in front of cameras and said what needed to be said, clearly, and on the record. The Guthrie family, he stated, had been nothing but cooperative and gracious throughout the entirety of the investigation. They were victims. Every member of the family, Savannah, Annie, their siblings, their spouses, had been investigated and cleared. NBC national law enforcement correspondent Tom Winter was equally direct. Not a single person briefed on this investigation, he said, had ever identified a single piece of evidence connecting any member of the Guthrie family to Nancy's disappearance. Not one piece. In an investigation generating tens of thousands of tips and hundreds of active leads, not one piece of evidence pointed toward the people who loved her most. The search warrant at Annie's home was procedure. The cameras found inside were noted and processed as part of a thorough forensic sweep that ultimately pointed entirely away from the family. What it pointed toward was a case far more complex and far more external than any proximity-based suspicion had suggested. And while the public was processing all of that, Savannah Guthrie was processing something else entirely. On April 6, 2026, more than 2 months after her mother vanished, Savannah walked back onto the set of the Today Show for the first time. She wore yellow, the color that supporters had adopted as a symbol of the ongoing search for Nancy. She sat down at the anchor desk. She looked into the camera, and she said, simply, "Ready or not, let's do the news." There is no script for that moment. There is no forensic frame for it. No clinical language that captures what it means to sit in a professional chair and do a professional job, while the most personal crisis of your life remains completely unresolved. A daughter doing her work while her mother is still missing, still unlocated, still recorded only by a device the FBI cannot yet reach. That detail does not need dramatization. The weight of it is already there, entirely on its own. In 2018, investigators ended a 40-year hunt for one of the most prolific, unidentified offenders in American criminal history. The Golden State Killer had operated across California for decades, leaving behind a forensic trail that traditional investigative methods had never been able to convert into a name. Witnesses, physical evidence, years of cold case work. None of it had produced an arrest. None of it had produced a face. For 40 years, he remained invisible. What finally broke that case was not a new witness. It was not a confession. It was not a surveillance camera, a tip line, or a search warrant. It was a genealogy database. A retired investigator uploaded a DNA profile recovered from a crime scene to a publicly accessible genetic database and began building a family tree around the partial matches that came back, cousin by cousin, branch by branch, until the tree pointed at one man living quietly in a Sacramento suburb. He had no idea that his relative's uploaded DNA had just ended his decades of invisibility. The method used to find him is called forensic investigative genetic genealogy, and it has since become one of the most powerful tools in law enforcement's forensic arsenal. It is now active in the Nancy Guthrie case. Understanding exactly how it works, and exactly where it is currently blocked, is the difference between this case going cold and this case breaking open. The process, in plain language, works like this. Investigators take a DNA profile recovered from a crime scene and upload it to genealogy databases that permit law enforcement access. The database scans for partial matches, not direct hits, but genetic similarities consistent with distant relatives. A third cousin, a second cousin twice removed, someone who shares enough genetic material with the crime scene contributor to suggest a common ancestor. Investigators then build a family tree outward from that match, cross-referencing with public records, applying geographic filters, eliminating branches that don't fit, narrowing systematically until the tree points at a single individual. This is precisely how Brian Kohberger was identified in the University of Idaho student killings. Investigators obtained a DNA profile from a knife sheath left at the scene. They built a family tree from a partial match. They worked outward from a distant relative and inward toward a suspect. They obtained a DNA sample from garbage outside Kohberger's parents' Pennsylvania home, confirmed the genetic connection, and that confirmation placed him in a courtroom. The infrastructure exists. The methodology is proven. The problem in Nancy Guthrie's case is a database access problem that is both technical and structural, and it has a solution that requires ordinary people to take one specific action. C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, laid it out with precision. The 3 largest consumer DNA databases in existence, Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage, together hold the genetic profiles of more than 50 million people. Those databases bar law enforcement access entirely. Investigators cannot upload a crime scene profile and search against them. The databases available to law enforcement GED Match, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice together hold fewer than 2 million profiles. That gap between 50 million profiles that investigators cannot access and 2 million that they can is the structural wall standing between the DNA evidence in this case and a potential suspect identification. But here is what closes that gap. Individual people. Anyone who has taken a consumer DNA test through Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, or any commercial service can download their raw DNA data file from the platform they used and upload it manually to GED Match or Family Tree DNA. Those platforms accept consumer uploads and make them accessible to law enforcement under specific investigative protocols. That one action, taken by one person, completed in under 10 minutes on a phone or a laptop, could place a relative of Nancy Guthrie's abductor inside a searchable database. And one relative in a searchable database is all it took to find the Golden State Killer. Moore made a direct appeal. She asked anyone who has already taken a consumer DNA test to take that step, download the raw data, upload it. Because the suspect in this case, whoever held that flashlight between his teeth, whoever wore those gloves, whoever stood at Nancy Guthrie's door at 1:47 in the morning, has family, has cousins, has a genetic trail connecting him to people who may already have their DNA sitting in a commercial database that law enforcement cannot touch. Unless those people move it somewhere, law enforcement can. The investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is not a cold case. It is not archived, reassigned, or deprioritized. Every piece of the forensic architecture described in this account remains active. The Pacemaker data extracted from the manufacturer's cloud server, the forensic record of the hours between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, is the backbone of the FBI's reconstruction of how the crime unfolded. That reconstruction begins not at the front door, not when the camera sees the masked figure, but at 1:40 in the morning, when a cardiac spike recorded a physiological event that no external system captured, 7 minutes of evidence that exists nowhere except inside the data preserved in a cloud server, and the body of a woman who has not been found. The aerial signal sniffer operation deployed over Tucson in the weeks following the disappearance continues to represent the operational limit of what is possible from the sky. The technology functions. The concept is precise. But a near-field Bluetooth signal broadcasting within arm's reach cannot be reliably detected from a helicopter over hundreds of square miles of terrain, and that reality has defined both the ambition and the constraint of the airborne phase of this search. The mixed DNA, recovered from inside Nancy's home, remains in a laboratory. The deconvolution software being accelerated specifically because of this case has not yet been publicly confirmed as released. Scientists are working against a deadline with a person's name attached to it, finishing technology that has never existed before because one investigation required it before the science was ready. The flashlight, the object held between the suspect's teeth in the doorbell camera footage, identified by C.C. Moore as a potential direct biological deposit from the suspect's own mucous membranes, has not been publicly confirmed as recovered or tested. That absence from the public record does not confirm it was never found. It confirms only that law enforcement has not chosen to disclose its status, which, in an active investigation with this level of forensic sensitivity, means almost nothing about what investigators actually know. The Range Rover processed in a restaurant parking lot near the Catalina Foothills neighborhood has not been publicly connected to a named individual. The man observed surveying the neighborhood 3 weeks before February 1st has not been publicly identified. No suspect has been named. No arrest has been made. The Guthrie family, Nancy's daughters, her son-in-law, every person closest to her, has been investigated and cleared. They are not a variable in this investigation. They are its motivation. The family's reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery stands at $1 million. The FBI tip line remains active. The Pima County Sheriff's tip line remains open, and the genealogy databases that could change the trajectory of this case entirely, GED Match and Family Tree DNA, are waiting for the upload. That shifts the balance from 2 million accessible profiles toward the 50 million that currently sit beyond law enforcement's reach. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She relies on daily cardiac medication. She has an implanted cardiac device with years of battery life remaining, logging data in the dark that nobody can currently read. She has a daughter who walked back onto a national television set wearing yellow because stopping, simply stopping, was not something this family was willing to do. She has a case that has accelerated forensic science, mobilized federal resources across multiple agencies and disciplines, generated more than 13,000 tips to the FBI alone, and produced forensic developments that have no precedent in the history of American criminal investigation. And she has not been found. The pacemaker is still running. That is not a dramatic closing line chosen for effect. It is the operational reality of this case, stated plainly. A device the size of a matchbox, implanted in the chest of an 84-year-old woman, has been logging cardiac data continuously since February 1, 2026. It is time-stamping every event. It is preserving every physiological second of whatever has happened to Nancy Guthrie since the moment her Bluetooth connection went dark at 2:28 in the morning. The only way to read that data is to find her, every forensic thread in this investigation, the cloud data already extracted, the mixed DNA waiting in the laboratory, the deconvolution software being finished in real time, the aerial signal operation, the genealogy database gap, the unconfirmed flashlight sample, the operational profile built from dead ends and reconnaissance reports. Every single one of them converges on the same conclusion. The evidence in this case is not missing. It is present. It is documented. It is being actively worked by some of the most sophisticated forensic minds in the country. What it needs is the one thing no laboratory, no helicopter, no subpoena, and no database upload can manufacture on its own. It needs someone who knows something to say something. It needs one partial match in a genealogy database to give investigators a branch of a family tree to start building. It needs the deconvolution software to finish and the mixed DNA to yield a profile that can be searched. It needs the thread that holds when everything else has been deliberately frayed. Investigations like this one do not end because investigators give up. They end because one piece of information arrives that unlocks every other piece that was already there. One cousin in a database. One tip that connects the surveying figure on January 11th to a name. One confirmed result from a piece of evidence that law enforcement has not yet disclosed publicly. This case will break. The evidence says so. The forensic architecture says so. The number of active investigative lines, the resources committed, the science being built specifically to resolve it, all of it says so. Nancy Guthrie was someone's mother on the evening of January 31st, 2026. She drove home through the Catalina foothills. Her garage door closed at 10:10. Her heart was calm. Her baseline was stable. And something changed that night, that a device inside her chest recorded in full. Every second of it preserved, time-stamped, waiting. The pacemaker is still running. Nancy Guthrie is still out there. And the investigation is still working. That is not an ending. That is a comma. If this coverage gave you something that other accounts of this case did not, if the forensic layer underneath the headlines is what you come here for, then this is exactly what True Crime Files does on every case that demands this level of depth and precision. Like this video so the algorithm keeps this investigation visible. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because when this case breaks, and based on everything the evidence says, it will break, you need to be here when it does. The tip line for this investigation is active. The genealogy databases are waiting, and somewhere out there, the most precise witness in this entire case is still recording in the dark, still logging, still keeping time, waiting for the day someone finds it and reads what it has been trying to say.